Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's lecture by Cosmin Costinas. Each academic year, curatorial studies at KASK and Conservatorium School of Arts, S.M.A.K, and the Gent University co-organize the Curatorial Lecture series, where we invite curators to share aspects of their practice in relation to a specific theme. This year's series is called the Curated Institution, and it casts a wide eye on the notion of curating as a form of institutional leadership. Can an institution be curated? Or how can the burgeoning and expanding curatorial field concerned with education, research, and participatory models come to critically reflect upon, inhibit, or even reimagine institutional structures? Within the frame of this question, we are happy to welcome this evening's speaker, Cosmin Costinas, whose curatorial trajectory covers a diversity of geographical and institutional contexts. I'll give a concise biography. From 2011 until 2022, he was executive director and curator of Parasite Hong Kong, originally founded as an artist-run space in 1996 and one of today's leading art centers in Asia. In 2022, he was co-curator of the Romanian Pavilion at the 59th Venice Biennial and curatorial advisor at the IK Triennale. And in 2018, he was a guest curator at the Dakar Art Summit and la Biennale de l'art africain contemporain in Dakar. We're happy to have caught him at this moment because he seems to be again in another transitional moment. He's currently co-artistic director of the 24th Biennial of Sydney, which is due to open next year. And he has recently been appointed as senior curator of exhibition practices at Berlin's transformed or in transformation Haus der Kulturen der Welt. So, Cosmin, thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening. There will be a short time after the lecture for questions, but for now we are very curious to hear more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's really like a great pleasure to be here and in this great museum and also with this affiliated with this great curatorial studies program. So thank you so much for the invitation. So the invitation was very much about and proposition of thinking about institutions and about how institutions work in the process of curating and what their mission is in society, how they articulate the pragmatics of organizing all the different processes that lay behind the artistic scene and the artistic milieu that we're building together. And I thought very much about like what kind of thinking process would be most interesting to share at this moment. And as mentioned, I am indeed like in a moment of transition, but I think that's less important than the fact that I think institutions are very much in a moment of transition these days. And I think with the many changes that our world and the different parts of our world are going through, the question of like the role that institutions can play is shifting very rapidly. And I think that we don't necessarily have definite and coherent answers to this question. So I thought that I would build my presentation around two exhibitions, and as and this can be perhaps interpreted as a type of intellectual investment in the format of exhibitions, as something that can perhaps still help us in the different intellectual and political processes that we consider relevant for artistic practice and for being in this world to be having. They're quite different exhibitions. So the first one was a show that I co-curated with Inti Guerrero, who is also teaching here in the program. So it was 10 years ago, and it was at Parasite at the institution where I was working until last year. And I chose that exhibition because of at least two reasons. One of them being the fact that it articulated, in our view, what an exhibition could potentially do in society, and how, what is it what is the type of, what is the knowledge and what is the action, the political action that an exhibition can achieve in our view. And I think that this is a great example in that sense. But the second reason why I chose to speak about this exhibition is because it also is clearly very much from another time. Even if it was 10 years ago, it clearly marked a very different moment in, I guess, our shared global history, certainly in the history of Hong Kong, where the exhibition was took place, and which was also the subject of the exhibition, but also in terms of like how exhibitions are imagined. The second exhibition I would like to talk about, I guess there's also two reasons for that, and one is because it's basically the Kathmandu Triennale, where I served as artistic director last year, and of course the institution here has many connections with the institution of the Kathmandu Triennale. And the director was the artistic director of the previous edition, but also because it is an exhibition that I think tried to touch many of the questions that I think are now perhaps most urgent to discuss when thinking about this platform of exhibitions. I think one, to begin with, so to begin with the, before actually like speaking about the first case study, one important starting point for any exhibition process, for any curatorial endeavor, should be a simple question. Does this, whatever one has in mind, whatever conversation one has with an artistic milieu at some point, and with an intellectual subject, and with a political engagement, does this need to take the form of an exhibition? Is there something about this format? Is there something that can be achieved in this format and in this format alone? Is there a particular type of knowledge that would come to light if this becomes an exhibition, if this uses the tools that are available to curating, to exhibition making? And answering this question with simply the importance, the urgency of the subject is probably not enough, and that's probably not really giving the full required answer to this question. And I think this is something that it's probably like the most general question I can come up with that still stands and can still be taken as a starting point for both exhibitions. So both the exhibition that took place 10 years ago and the exhibition that took place last year. Many other things would be different, and I will speak about them as I go through the exhibitions themselves. So the first one, in order to speak about the first one, there will be like quite a long expose of stories, of interrelated stories, of historical moments. So yeah, please bear with that long introduction. The exhibition, as mentioned, took place in 2013, and its primary intention was to make sense of the recent history of Hong Kong, the city where the institution I was working at the time was located, an institution that was very much at the core of many processes relevant for the Hong Kong art scene. It was started by a group of artists in 1996, so 1 year before the handover of Hong Kong to mainland China, to the People's Republic of China. So it is an institution that accompanied this transition of Hong Kong from the last major European colony in the world to being a city under Chinese sovereignty. And the intention behind the exhibition was to try to make sense of this history, was to try to understand the different cycles, the chronology that could organize the often conflicting conversations and topics that were on the public agenda in Hong Kong at the time. And it was very clear for us that 1997, the year of the handover, is not the most useful time stone to tell that history, to narrate that history, to organize that history. And it became apparent that there was another year that was more crucial in that sense, and that year was 2003. And specifically the spring of 2003, where different things happened. It was primarily the SARS epidemic, so the first version of the COVID virus that we all became very familiar with in the last 3 years, which had a very similar trajectory actually with with the second SARS virus. The consequences this had on the politics and society of Hong Kong, the consequences this had in jump-starting a pro-democracy movement, as well as shifting the relationships between Hong Kong and mainland China, all on a backdrop of changing projections about race, about the other, and about fear. These different phenomena were interlinked, were to a large extent in a relationship of cause and effect with each other, but there was also a certain degree of simultaneity, of coincidence, of connections that come through sharing a moment in time and space. And this led us to think of a journal as a tool for making sense of these facts, because a journal is primarily that. It is a cataloging of stories that are often connected to each other, as one life often is, but very much indiscernibly connected to facts that simply happen to occur at the same time. So this also led us to a particular journal that had a particular connection to another moment of epidemic. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. So we decided to borrow this title for the title of our exhibition. Maybe some of you are now more familiar with this book. I know that during the COVID lockdown, many people revisited the book, so you might have read it. And if you have, you probably remember that maybe the best way to describe it is of it being a study of fear, and a study of the economy of fear and the shifting form of fear. At the very beginning of the book the book was written in the 18th century. It is written in a format that was popular at the time as a claimed found journal of somebody who had gone through the 17th century Great Plague epidemic that engulfed London. So it's written purportedly 70 years after the actual facts described in the book. And at the beginning of the book, there is the conversation that is engulfing London is that of a fear caused by the Dutch-English war that was going on at the time, which was a colonial war that was primarily affecting a colonial possession. So there was England was not doing very well in the war, so there was this fear of losing a war that was, distant and somewhere far away. As the plague insinuates itself in the city of London, fear becomes stronger, but it also becomes nearer, and it becomes a more palpable reality in the life of the Londoners. The world at the same time shrinks. Wars taking place far away in the colonies disappear from the horizon of concern. As the epidemic spreads, everyone's world becomes smaller and smaller, and until everyone is largely isolated in their own homes. And this anatomy of fear describes very well the year that we were concerned with, 2003. I don't know how many of you remember the SARS epidemic and the kind of global moment it had. The most important difference between SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2, which led to the COVID epidemic, is that they're very similar viruses, but SARS was only contagious between symptomatic cases, between highly symptomatic cases. So it was much easier to control. It was basically about isolating people with symptoms. It started, the first identified case was in March of a visitor from mainland China who came to Hong Kong. The disease affected Hong Kong for a few months. It spread in a number of countries, from Canada, Taiwan, Singapore, and a number of others. It infected around 8,000 people. It killed around 800 people, so it had also like a much higher mortality rate than COVID, around 10%. But it was also like easier to contain. And, it eventually disappeared, I think in May or June of 2003. So the entire epidemic lasted for a few months. So it started in March, and this is something that we illustrated in the exhibition, which was to basically have a page from a local newspaper, the first page from a local newspaper, like throughout the month of March, and to see the change of headlines and the scope, the geographical scope of headlines, because for every day at the beginning of March 2003, the news was global, and it was about the impending American invasion of Iraq, which eventually took place at the end of March. By the time it actually happened, the first page of newspapers was actually occupied by local news and the news of this spreading unknown form of pneumonia in the city. So by the time this major and history-shifting global event actually occurred, the horizon and the attention in Hong Kong became limited to the borders of the city where this was taking place, where this fearful epidemic was taking place. But then, before I actually get to speak about the exhibition, there was going to be an even longer historical digression, which was really important, and it was really like crucial for us. And that basically starts in the 19th century, when so Hong Kong became a British colony in 1841. It was a significantly less populated territory prior to that, so so a lot of what constitutes Hong Kong history overlaps with the colonial period. And that history is particularly perverse. You might be familiar with, and this is again something that was like now discussed in our post-COVID global public sphere, when epidemiology became a subject of public conversation. Throughout the 19th century, one of the most important scientific debates, a debate that also had very clear political implications and had political sides that were supporting one argument over the other, was over the question of how diseases spread. Do diseases spread between individuals? Is contagion is something that occurs between human beings in one way or another? By the end of the 19th century, it was very clear, that the bacteria and viruses were discovered at the beginning of the conversation in the early 19th century. This was not exactly clear, but basically, what we consider science today was one of these camps. And the other camp was one that was believing that, well, diseases don't really spread between individuals. There's something about a particular place that makes people sick. And again, there were many, many actual explanations within this pseudo-theory. So things like the air being infested or sick, and one of the names under which this theory is known is the miasma theory, that miasmas, bad airs, infected airs, were somehow clouding over specific territories. Or, that the soil was guilty, or the angle of the sun rays, and so on and so forth. And this debate was not an innocent scientific debate, but it was one that was supported by specific interests. Again, not unlike, well, also like to a certain extent what we saw during the COVID period, but also like not unlike how the climate crisis is discussed along political lines and along economic interests that lie behind these different political positions. And in the 19th century, it was basically the proponents of free trade, of free global trade, that had the most to lose from accepting the reality of human-to-human contagion and the necessity for quarantines and all sorts of other measures that were impeding the free circulation of goods. And, well, in the 19th century, the biggest beneficiary of free trade was the British Empire. So there was a clear strategy in the middle of the 19th century by the Royal Navy, by different other structures in Britain to invest in the promotion of the miasmatic theory and to make efforts in stopping any theories that would trigger quarantine regimes around the world. So as part of this strategy, there was also like the need and the desire to prove the miasmatic theory, to prove that certain places are indeed particularly infested, ill, dangerous, and so on. And for around 30 years at least, there was a clear plan by the British Navy to prove that Hong Kong is such a place. So Hong Kong was basically chosen as a place that would prove the validity of the miasmatic theory, as a place where malaria was rampant, where several other tropical diseases was affecting people. So this was basically an important part of the colonial story of Hong Kong in the first decades. I'm just showing this image just to make it clear that this was not a story that only affected the British Empire. Another major beneficiary of free trade in Europe was the German city of Hamburg, whose economy relied on trade. And in 1892, and there was like again a clear strategy of not implementing any quarantine, any of the sort of safety, like the cordon sanitaire strategies against epidemics that already by the 1860s, 1870s became common in Europe, and none of these were implemented in Hamburg until the 1892 cholera epidemic. Cholera is another disease that entered Europe throughout the 19th century in waves. Almost all of them were coming from the east, so this is something that I will speak about later, but it's another disease that played very much with the racist imagination of epidemics in European consciousness as a disease coming from the east, so coming either, through the north of the Black Sea, so through Russia and Ukraine and Eastern Europe, or through Central Asia, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, and the Balkans. But by the end of the 19th century, the waves of cholera epidemics in Western Europe hardly killed a few dozens of people per year in major cities, so it was hardly a deadly disease. In 1892, 10,000 people died in Hamburg. It was by far the deadliest epidemic in Western Europe of cholera for many decades, and it was the final cross put to the miasmatic theory and official proponents of miasmatic theory as a matter of public health policy in Western Europe. But going back to Hong Kong, this history of trying to prove Hong Kong's misfortunate status as a epicenter of disease took a particular twisted turn in 1894 when the city played a prominent role in the last major pandemic wave of the plague. So the plague is, of course, a disease that was known in Asia and Europe for the past at least 1,500 years. It was one of the deadliest germs in human history. Probably the 6th century plague of Justinian had like major consequences. I mean, it killed a large proportion of citizens of the Byzantine Empire and around the Mediterranean. So it probably led to the well, many historical shifts of that time. Of course, the Black Plague in the 14th century, the Black Death, killed something between 40 and 60% of citizens of Europe, and probably around the same number of citizens in China, and likely similar numbers in basically in between. So a known killer that came back within its last wave at the end of the 19th century. It started in mainland China, it spread to Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong it actually spread to different places. It spread to California, where it was in San Francisco, it was a major killer for a few years. It went to India, where it also killed tens of thousands of people. But Hong Kong played a crucial role in this epidemic for several reasons. It changed very much the urban fabric of the city. So you see a lot of like demolitions that took place and sort of like a complete rethinking of the urban fabric. But the major role it played in this story was because it was in Hong Kong that two scientists, each working independently, discovered the culprit for the plague, discovered the bacillus that caused the plague. So this big mystery of a millennium and a half finally got a face, if you want. And it also got a name. And, you know, there was a Japanese and there was a Swiss scientist working on it. So you can guess which one of them got to name the bacillus. It was, of course, the Swiss scientist. So the pathogen of the plague is now known as Pestis yersinus, after the Swiss scientist working on it. And because we are in the age of the telegraph and we are at the end of the 19th century, and because this was a particularly interesting news, within weeks of papers being published in the Academy of Epidemiology in Paris, newspapers around the world often on the first page discuss this discovery. And they discuss it in relationship to the place in which it was discovered, Hong Kong. And they discuss it in relation to another horizon of fear that was prevalent in the Western world in that period at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And because we were talking about fear, and how our exhibition, which you know we will still get to, was primarily interested in fear, it's important to make a step back and speak a bit about fear and how fear is a instrument that is often used in societies to create common enemies, to affirm common identities. It is also like used to manage periods when other forms of social struggle could become dangerous, and that sort of focus of public debate needs to move somewhere else. And in the Europe of peace of the end of the 19th century, the continent that had not been at war with each other for, well, at least since 1871, and for and you know, on a grander, larger scale, not since actually like the age of Napoleon, a continent that was getting richer much faster and more connected to each other, a continent that was also in the decade when it conquered most of the world. So this is another important point to make, that of course European colonial history is a history of 500 years, but the last decade of the 19th century was by far the moment when a larger part of the world was conquered and occupied and colonized by different European powers, from the African continent to Southeast Asia to the Pacific. So in that moment of global triumph, if you wish, of peace on the continent, a horizon of fear needed to be invented, and that was primarily located in Asia. The racist horizon of fear in Europe, United States, but also other European settler colonies around the world was primarily built around a fear of a rising Asia. This is known under a common umbrella of the Yellow Peril, and it contained different stories, many of them very familiar to us, many of them used in current conversations. It was about the lack of morals, lack of personality of people from Asia, lack of hygiene. So these processes of othering, process of dehumanization, and processes of creating agents of fear were interlinked with each other. As you can see here, so as a mix of disease and of body and moral corruption, but also, cheap labor, also the economic fears that, not so much the kind of outsourcing that happened in the globalized era, but more the migration, the fear that migrants from Asia could, spoil the labor market. A wall was being discussed, again, something very familiar. And this was a multi-layered complex of racism. It was one that was combining a specific fear, primarily towards the Chinese, related to the great numbers of the Chinese, the risk of being overrun, the risk of some sort of takeover through numbers, which was parallel to a fear of Japan, which was of a different nature, and it was the fear of a different type of competition, a fear of being overrun, and the fear of losing that status of Europe as the place of civilization. And this took a particular sharp turn in 1905, when Japan defeated Russia in the war that they had. And it was basically the first time in many centuries, in fact, since the Mongol invasions of Europe, that non-European power defeats a European power in an all-out war, which contributed to this complex of fear. This is, well, the first artist I'm actually talking about from the exhibition. So well, the whole complex of the yellow fear, of the yellow peril, translated into particular caricatures and typologies of Asian masculinity, Asian femininity that, well, some of them can still be encountered in many contexts, but throughout the 20th century, in Hollywood, you know, the great factory of our projections and of our and of tools through which we actually like imagined our world, this became very common. So the over-sexualized image of the Asian woman and the hyposexualized image of the Asian man, seen as being demasculinized and being seen as you know, not working with strength, not working with the stereotypical attributes of masculinity, but rather working through deception. But now we're getting back to 2003. So why was this so important for us? Not just because this is a history of Hong Kong, not just because this is a history of Hong Kong that deals with similar topics of you know, epidemics and politics and xenophobia, but precisely because a certain history of creating imagery and creating language to describe a fear of other people. No, to describe a fear of other people and of cultural contamination through a medicalized language of a fear of pathogens, a fear of infection, was coming back. And was coming back in 2003 Hong Kong. Not least because, well, the disease itself entered Hong Kong through mainland China, but because it played in to the imagination of the subsequent facts that took place after March 2003. This is another fragment of something that we showed in the exhibition, and that was, well, this is another, I think, good example of how of how things changed in the last 10 years for all of us. What we wanted to do was to try to illustrate how Hong Kong felt in March and April 2003, a city abandoned, a city without people. And of course this was before SARS, before all our cities were for a shorter or longer period of time absolutely deserted. But this was you know, completely impossible to imagine for anyone who has not gone through Hong Kong during the SARS period, of like, how would a great capitalist metropolis look like if it would be devoid of people on the street? So we could only rely on Hollywood to provide such an image. And there's this fragment from Vanilla Sky when Tom Cruise wakes up and goes to Times Square in New York and there's nobody on the street. And, you know, there's this deep moment of fear of, you know, the great capitalist machinery standing still. Again, something that we all ended up experiencing in one way or another later on. But at the time, this was something that, you know, only affected Hong Kong as an exception. So, we're in March 2003. This unknown disease spreads rapidly through Hong Kong. Nobody knows exactly where it's coming from, how many people it will kill. At the end of the month, there are also conversations that the city might be put into lockdown, that the borders might close. something that, again, was completely inconceivable in the pre-COVID era, and it eventually did not happen, but it functioned as a great warning of, something utterly exceptional that could happen. Primarily because this was something only affecting Hong Kong rather than the whole world. The actual crash of the stock exchange and of the real estate prices in Hong Kong was severe, was actually like much higher than what happened during COVID in any single city. So some of the first actually measure that the Hong Kong government put in place already in April 2003 to try to stop this economic collapse was to allow visitors from mainland China to enter Hong Kong without a visa. So even if the handover of Hong Kong to mainland China took place in 1997, the border still remains, and the border is still something that needs to be crossed with passports and different types of visas. But it was exceedingly difficult for citizens of mainland China to enter Hong Kong prior to 2003, and the numbers were in the order of a few tens of thousands. And 2018, so the last year before protests, it was something like 53 million yearly visitors from mainland China. So obviously a huge difference. That's also like why Hong Kong actually was by far the highest, the most visited city in the world in all rankings. So over Paris and over other actual tourist destinations because of this large number of tourists coming from mainland China. And this change, well, had enormous consequences, social and economic consequences, but it immediately enhanced a particular type of homophobia, of xenophobia in Hong Kong in regards to mainland Chinese. And to the left is an ad that was published in a very popular newspaper that also had to close actually in 2020. So it's this history actually continued. But a very popular newspaper at the time, and it was financed through crowdfunding, and it was basically spreading fear about visitors and people coming to give birth from the mainland. And the imagery is that of locusts coming over Hong Kong. So this is just one example of several images and words and expressions that became popular in Hong Kong to describe this fear of being taken over, this cultural contagion, this political contagion, this economic takeover that was yet again using references from biology, from the world of non-humans, to describe a fear of the other. Of course, the perversity of Asian and specifically Chinese employing this imagery as part of a fear of others, of other Chinese, was very much part of the conversation. Well, to the right is another example of a mass hysteria moment as part of this story, and somehow the fear that mainland Chinese visitors would buy all the baby formula available in Hong Kong, and somehow, the children of people in Hong Kong would starve to death and not have what to eat, which is particularly absurd in a city that, again, prior to the events of the last 3 years was consistently ranked as the freest economy in the world, a place where you could import and export anything except baby formula, something that was eventually limited as a response to this public fear. So, no, I'll speak about this afterwards. So, while this was happening, remember that we're talking about the journal, the government of Hong Kong, so besides passing the law of allowing visitors from mainland China to enter the city without visa, so fundamentally changing and altering the relationship between the two sides of the border and the economic dynamics between the two places. Also tried to pass another law, tried to essentially pass a security law, a national security article in the city's constitution. It was basically it was betting on the idea that everybody would be too afraid of disease, too much, isolated and keeping it to themselves, and would not be noticing or minding that a national security law would be passed in Hong Kong. And this was basically, this would have been a law that would have given instruments to the government to control different aspects of political and social expression. But this very much backfired. And in spite of this prevailing fear of infection, huge numbers of people turned out on the streets of Hong Kong. It's important to mention here, again, through the perspective of COVID, that the politics of assembly and the politics of fear were actually very different than in terms of COVID, primarily because it was a virus that was only transmitting between symptomatic cases. There was no moral restriction in gathering between people without symptoms. And in fact, there was an encouragement of that to happen, to not lose a sense of commonness and of society, and because of unjustified fear, which was that fear of getting infected from people without symptoms, something that worked almost oppositely from the ethics and politics of fear during COVID, and that's primarily related to the mechanism of contagion between the two viruses. So this idea of coming together somehow, to the idea of responding to self-imposed months of quarantine and of social isolation with coming together was a very powerful manifestation of that era. So on the 1st of July 2003, so the anniversary of the handover, one of the largest protests in Hong Kong history, until the much larger protests of 2019 came on the streets of Hong Kong. Because we were living in another historical era, the pressure from the streets was enough to shelve the law. So the law was not passed at the time, and it was only passed in 2020, so later on, also like after this exhibition took place. And also like what happened was that this actually led to a renewed generation of political protests in Hong Kong, which consisted of giant annual marches on the 1st of July as a constant reminder that democracy was a principle and freedom of expression was a principle that was at the core of Hong Kong values. They are now banned, so they're not taking place anymore, but they did take place until 2020. This also then led to specific moments of, outbursts and protests, including the umbrella movement of 2014 and of 80 days of occupation of 3 major parts of Hong Kong. What happened? Yeah, it also led to the protests of 2019, when at some point 2 million people, which was a third of the population of Hong Kong, was protesting at the same time on the streets of the city. So a history that went beyond the time frame of the exhibition and very much shaped Hong Kong of our time. So let me now go back to the last story of this journal. So on the 1st of April 2003, which was in many ways the darkest moment of the epidemic, it was actually the day when the rumors of the city being quarantined and of being placed in lockdown were circulating. Another major event took place, and it was the suicide, and quite dramatic suicide, of Leslie Zhang, who jumped from the top of the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in central Hong Kong. And because we're speaking in Europe, and I don't know how many people in the room are familiar with Leslie Zhang. Maybe you might know him as an actor in some films like Happy Together by Wong Kar-wai, or in Farewell My Concubine. But he's also and primarily known as a singer throughout Asia. He's possibly the most successful Pan-Asian star of all times. He's one of the first popular culture figure to be successful throughout East and Southeast Asia that was not from just that particular country or from, being a Western popular culture figure. So the first Asian that also had success in other Asian countries. So from the 80s and 90s, it was really, it's almost impossible to exaggerate the stature he had in many ways. But one of the roles he played was also to contribute to a sense of identity in Hong Kong. Hong Kong largely defined its own sense of identity, its own sense of placehood around popular culture, around Cantonese-speaking popular culture, around cinema and music of the 70s and 80s. Hong Kong, as mentioned earlier, has a relatively young history, and in the pre-war era, the sense of place and the sense of common identity was, hardly existing. So this started to a large extent in the late 60s, and then developed in the 70s and 80s. And if we think of like classic processes of imagining nations and the role that an existing or an invented folklore plays in these processes, that folklore, that role of a folklore in the case of Hong Kong was largely taken up by cantopop and by popular culture based on the Cantonese language. And at the top of this cultural edifice was Leslie Jung. He was really the most important singer and the most important actor to play that role. As an actor and also as a singer and as a public persona, he was also extremely versatile. He was queer, and he was somehow quite complicatedly out of the closet, which was, quite a courageous thing to do in the circumstances of the time. He was also somebody who was able to play very different roles, from very classical masculinity to different forms of non-binary and trans identities, whether self-constructed or by embodying non-Western forms of gender fluidity, such as the Beijing opera character he played in Farewell My Concubine. So in a way, he was this very versatile figure which on one hand was a symbol of this nascent community, but on the other hand was also a figure onto which different people could project different images. So somebody of this stature and somebody of this huge symbolic power committing suicide in that dramatic fashion in that day also contributed to a sense of a world that was ending, of a world of an era and of a particular moment in the history of Hong Kong that was coming to an end. So this is him in Farewell My Concubine. This is the funeral that took place, and I guess some people would be arguing that the funerals, that his funeral in that spring, to which tens of thousands of people participated, were also a crucial step in people coming together for the protests, and a few weeks after that. So that this was a step in that process of people overcoming their fear of coming together and of leaving their self-imposed quarantine and by and having the yearning to come together in a social body on the street. So this was a very long story, there were many stories as well, but what does this have to do with an exhibition? You will ask yourself, and it's a legitimate question, because this goes back to what I said at the beginning of what are ultimately exhibitions, and how do exhibitions accomplish this important question of what is it that they can do on their own? What is it that they can teach us that we cannot learn from other methods through cinema, through journalism, through writing, through essay writing, through many other very valid ways of advancing what we know and what we can say and what we can imagine. And well, the thesis is that exhibitions do have their own grammar, that there is something about the particular configuration of the different artistic subjectivities that are being brought together, to the spatial realities, to the architectural realities, to the institutional realities, both in terms of the complex and invisible place that institutions have in communities, as well as the more pragmatic position that they have in cities and in places, all contribute to this production of language and this production of images that exhibitions are able to do in ways that, you know, in our argument, no other method and you know, set of instruments that is at our disposal these days can do. That there is something about this associative power and ambiguity and yet strength of arguments that can be made that are, you know, only possible through curating, through exhibition making of this sort. And this also then determined the format of the talk today, because a story that is told to an audience is then fundamentally different than what can be experienced in an exhibition. And an exhibition would have played along these histories and worked along these histories in a fundamentally different way than that of a narrative. And that's why there were very few, if any, images shown, because the way the show was constructed was very different than what I presented here. It was not an essay on the walls of a gallery. It was not a chronological story. I mean, my talk was not particularly chronological, and I was like jumping from moments to moments. But what the exhibition also did was not that. There was certain association of works and of images of archival material that were connected to all of the stories that I presented. But there were many other things, crucial things that were happening in the exhibition. There was an entire history of performance art, for example, from different contexts, primarily across Asia, that primarily relied on a performer putting their own bodies, vulnerable bodies, out there as a tool of performance. It was primarily about also performances that took place at moments of great change across different contexts in Asia. So we had a performer from Hong Kong from the 1980s, actually, like when the impending handover was announced. So the 1997 moment was when it was announced in the 80s, and a Singaporean performer from the 90s, again, a moment of great change for the city. Also like a performer from Kazakhstan, immediately in the post-Soviet era. And why did we include them? Well, it was because while being in an environment like the exhibition, this kind of like stories of you know, stereotyping, of dehumanization, also like required a counterpoint. And there were basically like stories of resistance and stories of like how individuals using art and from within artistic language could resist such processes. So this is one example of how, you know, the experience of seeing the show and being in the show was, you know, fundamentally different than that of a single coherent intellectual narrative trying to make some points. But then in the specific case of this show, then what this exhibition achieved, and this was something that made it, I think, in many ways the most I would say the successful exhibition that I think, like, you know, both of us were involved because of the particular impact it had in different conversations, was that several of these stories were very complicated to be brought together. And several of these stories are this connection is very tensed. And primarily, the very legitimate history of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, the very legitimate resistance from an oppressive regime from Beijing, and the distinction, yet the parallelism and the partial overlapping of this with the history of xenophobia from Hong Kong towards mainland Chinese is something very complicated to discuss, because it's basically something that shadows an otherwise legitimate history of resistance. So the fact that this exhibition, put them together, but put them together in a way that also analyzed their origin and placed them all in the same genealogy, and basically, looked at this 2003 moment of when, as the moment of genesis of both of these, threads that define the public conversation in Hong Kong. And then to do that in a broader history and looking how the images and the words used to tell this story can then be identified in a colonial history of the 19th century. And then, all the connections with Leslie Cheung and how, a collective imaginary was particularly affected by all this transformation taking place. We really believe that it was only an exhibition that could do this, that could really take that effort to bring this material together in a way that could also be accepted, and in a way that can also be not violent to people who were actually living these stories. And then the exhibition had all these moments which allowed for this to happen. So I guess this was the example of an exhibition that worked in a particular way. How are we with time? Oh, yeah. This. Yeah. This was quite long. I'll do it a much shorter conversation about the Kathmandu Triennale, because I was really wanted to bring it in the conversation here. So can we switch the files, please? Oh wow, this was really long. Because in the email there were 2 links. Should be, yes. We don't have time. Maybe just to show the images if they're there, but they're definitely separate. But they were in the same email. There were two links. Yeah. Well, then I'm afraid we have to stop here. But then, if there are questions, or I'd be. No. Sorry. I should put them in a single presentation next time. That will also keep it shorter, I guess.
There's a lot of material. I think it's a lot to take in, probably, with all the historical layers and all the associations, but a beautiful example of how to dig into a context and a history where you are working and giving it a sort of renewed actuality or a renewed reflection on the actual events that were happening, and a very interesting synchronization of these three elements around that year of 2003. Just not a question, but...
Talking about the format of exhibition, of choosing an exhibition as the only format. Sorry. Yes. I had a question about the format of the exhibition, because you said in the beginning of your lecture that the most important question to ask is whether the knowledge you would like to transfer, there the format of the exhibition is the most adequate one. Could you explain what kind of arguments or maybe categories you are using, and are you also using alternatives when you decide an exhibition is not the right format? Do you then use alternatives, or do you mix certain formats?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, there's not so many other things that I know how to make, so I can't make, documentary film, for example, which would be, I guess, a great tool, in some cases. I mean, I guess for people in our profession, like writing is often that alternative, and I think that's the biggest conflict that we tend to have between organizing our thoughts in a writing form and through our own thinking processes and through our own grammar and through our own unconflicted logical constructs in a text that an exhibition can sometimes help us escape. And an exhibition, often doesn't impose on us and allows us to explore different devices of association and different paths of navigating arguments. And I guess, I mean, like going back to this example, I mean, there were certain things that now I also actually said them quite lightly 10 years after the exhibition took place, and after many of the things that were horizons of fear in 2003 as well as in 2013 and have actually happened in the last 10 years. So many of the things that might be easy to say now were not possible to be said then. That the most we could do was to bring them, in the same space. Some things we could do more with it, but in some cases it was just about that, mental and effective effort of bringing things there without, being able to do anything more with them. And, so that's, again, something that exhibition is, I don't know if the only one, but it's maybe the best environment for such actions to be possible.
Hey, thank you for the presentation. You started in 2011 in Parasite.
Yes.
You made the show there, or yeah. My question was mainly, do you think because being a curator that is not a citizen, did it make it easier for you to open this conversation, you think? Or did you, what was your experience with that?
I mean, it's something that we certainly thought about a lot, and it's also something that it's also a conversation that changed over the last 10 years of like, you know, of how one positions oneself in context. I mean, a lot of the conversation was led by the people in the show, who were primarily from Hong Kong. It was also like led by people who were not from Hong Kong, but were also like from places that have gone through similar processes. So, you know, not the kind of like neutral Western observers, so to speak, but people who have gone through various analogous processes as well. So who had something to speak about that was relevant for the conversation. As a foreigner, it was complicated. I mean, I think, you know, and it's a complicated conversation, you know, the status of a foreigner, and also like now not being in the city anymore. I think definitely the way we imagined our position there was that of people who fully dedicated themselves to the place. I mean, we lived there, and we were very much, you know, part of that social fabric and of the many political developments that took place there. It was also, it is also like a complicated answer to give now, because now there are, you know, political risks to having this type of conversations, which was not the case at the time. And in the context of political risks, one's status as a local or a foreigner differs, which was not the case at the time, because this entire layer of you know, risk of different sorts of, you know, from direct arrest to marginalization and to isolation of different sorts was not there. So this is, again, a conversation that is very much shifting and has shifted a lot in the last 10 years.
Yeah. I was going to ask, so you left like, what, a year ago, 2 years ago now?
A year ago.
So you had some space and time to look at what those 10 years were for you there, and I imagine a lot has changed in those 10 years. Like, perhaps I'm also curious to know a bit more, instigating these conversations through the exhibition. Did you feel the impact of that a year later with the protests and things like that, or how was that for you?
Oh, very, very intense. Also, like on a personal level, for sure. I think, you know, I think it also. I think one of the. This is the only exhibition older than 2 years that I talk about. You know, I mean, I usually move on from, you know, exhibitions, but I think it's precisely the fact that the political developments in Hong Kong, and, you know, also like the political and epidemiological events of the last 3 years in the world made this exhibition not just relevant because of the subject, but I think on a very personal level, since you brought it up, it triggered sort of like different processes of reflection, and you know, both about the subject of the exhibition and about curating in general, and about, you know, this idea of like, what can our contribution be, and how do we navigate context, and how do we work with artists, and how do we work with audiences, and how do we work with you know, shifting environments, as our global environment is at the moment, you know, because in a way, you know, what Hong Kong has gone through, the whole world is somehow going through, and it's going through, you know, big changes that are not necessarily for the better. So it's a question of like, how do we learn from these experiences and apply them on a global level? Yeah.
Any more questions?
I have one very pageant kind of question. I would like to know, what was the most challenging
I mean, I think it was that, basically. So I think it was probably that, of like how to navigate this conversation. I mean, it was, I mean, I think also like as a foreigner, it's important to, to also like further describe my position of, having been appointed to be in this particular institution. So having been, somehow asked to engage with the community, So it also came. So it wasn't so much as a, an external agent that chooses to go and appropriate, but somehow, being in that position where this was actually part of my job that was at the time entrusted on me. So it was trying to navigate that, the things that I had to do with the things that I wanted to do, but were, not a very straightforward thing to do, and had to be like, parts of different negotiation. And then the exhibition also traveled, something that we did not initiate, so it was something that came as external invitations. And when the first conversation happened, we were like, I mean, I can't think of a show that is more connected to a place. How would this work in other contexts? So it went a year after to Taipei in Taiwan, which was maybe the best version of the show somehow, where, it was the best one because, we were able to do more research, and also because after understanding how the show works together, after installing it in Hong Kong, we were able to reinstall it a bit differently. But in terms of like work of mediation, there was very little to change because the contexts are so similar. I mean, both in terms of going through similar historical processes and, like quite an analogous relationship with the mainland and the projection of the mainland and what the mainland is, but also, deep cultural understanding. And, I mean, there was the SARS also like affected Taiwan at the same time. And I mean, Leslie Jung is huge in Taiwan as well. We had actually like a little shrine that we were building with fan groups, and we had that in Hong Kong, and we had that in Taipei as well. It was very easy to find these fan groups. And then we were invited in Korea at a much larger museum, so that was like one particular challenge. But then there was the conversation of like how to translate it to a context that was, from the same region and sharing many things, having many things in common, but being also like very different, of course. Not the Leslie Jung part, which is hugely popular in Korea as well, and we had fans there as well. But there was a significant part of the exhibition that was happening there that was like a very Korean conversation, which we did together with curators at the museum, and actually like specifically with one of the artists who I think interpreted a lot of the there was always the Hong Kong core was there, so there was a very clear idea that this is the story of Hong Kong, and and you have to immerse yourself into it, and this is how every good story that is told needs to be, so you need to enter a world to understand it and to get the full potential of a story, rather than eliminating the two local anecdotes and so on. But then alongside this core, there was this new branch that was built, which was a very Korean story, and it was, yes, a lot of it was connected to the fear of the North in the South, and the fear of the communist infiltration and the different ways of dehumanization that take place in that conversation. And then the last one was in San Francisco, so where yeah, that was then taken very much through the context of Asian American communities in California, and you know the different histories there, the histories of racism. I mean, the plague of 1906 in San Francisco, which you know came from Hong Kong, and it was basically the same epidemic wave. Played a crucial role in the history of Chinese Americans and in the history of California in general, and you know, it had its own way of triggering and playing with racism and anti-Asian racism in California. So yeah, many specific challenges along the way.
Okay, I think we can probably end it here. Thank you again, Cosmin, and
Thank you. Yes. And
we can take the Kathmandu Triennale
sorry. Yes.
into the bar, maybe. Yeah. Thank you again.